Hi, everyone. We are on our second day of the AI for Climate Mexico Lightning Talk series powered by Huawei. It is an extreme, it's very, very, very nice to introduce you to a very, very smart person today. I'm gonna let Mariana, who's part of my team at C-Minds, introduce her in a little bit. I'm gonna introduce myself. First of all, my name is Lucia Troches. I'm the Global Forum Director of AI for Climate, of the AI for Climate Global Forum. AI for Climate is an initiative that wants to create the intersection between the use of new technologies like artificial intelligence and the conservation of different ecosystems and the protection of the environment to protect us from climate change, which is such a topic these days. Just FYI, we are on the webinar function at Zoom, at the Zoom platform. For everyone who's here, you can choose to your language of preference on the interpretation bottom, on the bottom of the screen. So if you go to interpretation, you can see a little globe below in the menu, and you can click on it and go to English or Spanish, depending on what you prefer. And there's going to be a translator, who's Marco, who's here, who's going to be doing the interpretation for us today. So thank you, Marco, for that. And without further ado, Mariana, please.
Thank you. Well, we are very happy to have you today here, Bogdana. I will share a short video with the audience so that they can get to know you a little bit better. So Bogdana helped start the responsible AI team at Accenture, where she's a data scientist. She has focused on investigating and mitigating downstream risk of AI models, empowering marginalized populations, and encouraging social and environmental justice. She's a lead guest editor of the Springer Special Issue Journal, named Intersections of AI and Community Wellbeing. She's also a research fellow at Partnership on AI, and she's also part of the Happiness Alliance. And she will be talking to us today about exploring the intersection of environmental justice and unintended consequences of AI. And before giving you the microphone, Bogdana, I would also like to remind the audience that we will have a space for questions and answers that Lou and I will be hosting. So please, you can leave all your questions and comments for Bogdana on the Q&A tool that is on Zoom. If you're watching us from Facebook, please leave them on the comments or on the chat here on Zoom. So Bogdana, the microphone is all yours, and we're very happy to have you.
Thanks so much, Mariana. And just to double check if you see my screen now.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. I am joining you today from the unceded territories of Ramaytush Ohlone Indigenous Peoples lands, also known as San Francisco, California. And I'm really excited to be here, and big thank you to all of you for being here and to the organizers for putting together this series. Before I begin, also, I want to note that I do not represent any of the organizations which I'm going to mention, but will be sharing my personal perspectives based on my work and research collaborations. So please also consider this as an invitation to a dialogue instead of just a talk. So in our current context marked by a pandemic, AI and data that underpins it are key for healthcare policy, vaccine research, risk management, and many other areas of human life. Based on a number of research publications, in the next 5 to 10 years, virtually all areas of our life are going to be either directly or indirectly influenced by AI systems. I think that we need to appreciate that not only AI-driven technology impacts all areas of human life, but it does also influence the life of all other living beings on the planet in complex, dynamic ways. This is why I think it is critical to consider a relational environmental justice lens on the use of AI-driven technology. And my goal in the next 20 minutes or so is to share with you about my journey and forensic investigation of working to understand this better, specifically also pinpointing what could we do to advance the conversation further and catalyze action. So let me start from the very beginning. I come from Sofia, Bulgaria, a post-communist country at the heart of Eastern Europe. And right now, as one of the core members of the responsible AI team at Accenture, I have a passion for investigating complex issues in the intersection of technology, people, jobs, equity, and inclusion. I've also led projects that are driven by future frameworks and enable new modes of AI and data governance in multiple industries. At Partnership on AI, we worked on interdisciplinary investigation to create organizing frameworks that challenge existing business models in order to adequately consider the unintended consequences of AI systems. Also, recently, together with the Happiness Alliance nonprofit, we've been building tools that enable policymakers to take into account well-being data in the policy process, bridging the gap between policymakers and community well-being. Being away from my home country for a very long time has allowed me to reconnect with my Bulgarian roots. One way that I inevitably get reminded about my roots is through my name. My name, Bogdana, literally means God is generous. So from a very early age, I was fascinated by people's generosity. It wasn't contained in what they had in terms of material possessions, but it was expressed in their actions and how they would make you feel, even in the most challenging moments in life. I clearly remember being impatient about growing up because I felt that the future itself is generous, giving us opportunities to imagine and build new worlds. In the teachings of my Bulgarian ancestors, responsibilities and generosity or gifts are understood as two sides of the same coin. The possession of a gift is coupled with duty to use it for the benefit of all. And every time I'm in nature, I'm overwhelmed by gratitude for the generosity of Mother Nature, bringing in me a sense of reciprocity and relationality. Relationality is rooted in context. And perhaps the most important context is place or place-based in relation to a territory. In the case of AI systems, we need to consider the physical as well as the virtual places where technology is designed, developed, and deployed. I think that we need to consciously acknowledge that particular worldviews arise from particular territories, and the relational nature between the territory and human and ecological well-being. With that wider lens in mind, what did it mean to extend our circle of relationships to include AI? To begin with, what do we even mean by AI? Leading AI scholar Kate Crawford, in her recent book, Atlas of AI, provides a map of the natural resources that drive the AI industry, the energy that it consumes, the hidden labor all along the supply chain, and the vast amounts of data that are extracted from every platform and device that we use every day. In doing that, she says, quote, I wanted to really open up this understanding of AI as neither artificial nor intelligent. It's the opposite of artificial. It comes from the most material parts of the Earth's crust and from human bodies laboring and from all the artifacts that we produce and say and photograph every day. Neither it is intelligent, end of quote, in the same way as we understand human intelligence. I think that transformative action is about deep questioning. A question I have is, how do we even start to think about the socio-ecological impact of AI-driven systems? One place to start is understanding the use of AI for climate through an anthropological lens introduced to us by early cyberneticist Gregory Bateson in his 3 levels of learning framework. Using his metaphor, one can't see the forest for the trees. He depicts learning level 1 as only seeing the trees, while learning level 2 might be stepping out and seeing the forest as a whole, recognizing its existence. And finally, learning level 3, in his structure, it's the sort of helicopter view, seeing fully that a number of alternative forests exist, and they each have unique ecological characteristics. So in relation to AI for climate, learning level 1 is geared towards effectiveness and efficiency, doing things better, rather than doing better things, and even more so on a deeper level, seeing things differently. So such higher level of learning and understanding require broadening the set of questions we ask when we consider using AI for climate and assessing the impact of particular AI applications. Consider, for example, the way AI systems are used in forest restoration projects. Computer vision is being used to determine forest carbon sequestration potential. Drones are used to collect data about the land topography and soil condition that can be combined with satellite data and analyzed to determine the best locations to plant each seed. By conducting an AI impact assessment, then we could analyze the impact of potential bias in the data, which is used to train the computer vision algorithm. We could also assess if there is sufficient level of human oversight, transparency, explainability, and accountability mechanisms with regards to how the data is collected and used. An AI impact assessment will also measure the carbon footprint of training a large machine learning model. The need for conducting an AI impact assessment in the first place is often regulation, which is why we see their adoption in some industries rather than others. Moving beyond a checkbox approach to AI impact assessment starts with asking questions. This is why I think that bringing in perspectives from the work on environmental justice in the context of AI impact assessments could contribute to the positive impact of AI's use for climate. So what I'll frame here as design for responsibility is related to using new modes of engagement in AI that enable radical participation and inclusion, contributing to equitable futures for human and non-human participants and the environment. The questions we need to answer relate to how can we build non-exploitative and non-predatory mechanisms for engaging with people with lived experience? And also, what can we learn from other disciplines and traditions, both academic, activists, or others, and how to engage with community partners and constructively participate in coalition building work? So for me personally, very influential other disciplines have been action research, speculative and critical design, and systems thinking. For example, an environmental justice lens on the use of drones in forest restoration projects would inspire a different kind of dialogue among local and indigenous communities, policymakers, civil society, environmental climate scientists, technologists who are working on the specific AI systems, and other stakeholders. Environmental justice is primarily concerned with how marginalized populations are disproportionately impacted by environmental degradation and contamination, mostly from industrial and military facilities. Environmental justice must often wrestle with industry and state-produced data that often erases environmental violence and is not created by or for impacted communities. At the same time, these communities must often work with these data, even though it is not accounting for environmental injustices. In addition, the data justice community provides ways in which community control over their data could be increased through data sovereignty, community ownership, and active engagement in directing data gathering, distribution, and analysis. Also, indigenous data sovereignty is the right of a nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. Environmental justice means advancing climate solutions that link human rights and development in a human-centered approach, placing the needs and voices and leadership of those who are the most impacted at the center. Environmental personhood, on the other hand, is a legal concept which designates certain environmental entities the status of a legal person. Today, a version of environmental personhood has been adopted in New Zealand, Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, and other places around the world, where in some cases, mountains and rivers are now given rights, protections, privileges, and can be represented in court, usually by appointed representatives from indigenous communities whose natural cultural history is deeply connected with a specific territory. This work has started in 1972 with Professor Christopher Stone's article, Should Trees Have Standing? Towards Legal Rights and for Natural Objects, where Professor Stone describes how under the existing structure of law, nature was considered rightless, having no legally recognized rights to defend and enforce. Later, in 1989, Professor Roderick Nash published The Rights of Nature, A History of Environmental Ethics, in which he explains how throughout history, the rightless, slaves, women, others, have struggled to expand the body of legal rights to include themselves. He provides a context for how and why the body of rights is moving in the direction of expanding to include nature. For further resources, I encourage you to look up the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative community, which asks where, how, and by whom and for whom are environmental data collected, stored, and used, and also what tools do we need to support community digital literacy and work towards more equitable, transparent, and inclusive models of environmental data governance. Also, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Mother Nature community has tremendous amount of resources on the history of environmental personhood around the world and practical case studies of where and how it was adopted. In fact, in 2017, Mexico City passed new constitution, including provision requiring rights of nature law, such as the recognition and regulation for broader protection of rights of nature, formed by all its ecosystems and species as a collective entity subject of rights. So now we turn to AI, and specifically the AI impact assessment process. I started out learning about AI's impact assessment through taking a class on ethics and governance of AI at Harvard Law School, which was led by internet law professor Jonathan Zittrain. It was actually the first year that they had this class, and during the very first lecture, this is the slide that Professor Zittrain showed to us. Not surprisingly, his definition of AI was arcane, pervasive, tightly coupled, adaptive, autonomous systems. He'd also frequently use a quote by science fiction writer Leigh Brackett to describe some of the common misconceptions of AI, saying that it is witchcraft to the ignorant, simple science to the learned. There is a lot of gray area around AI and its socioeconomic impacts, but perhaps the biggest barrier in my view is the way we perceive time, and therefore distinguish between short-term and long-term time horizons. I think that an effective use of AI impact assessments allows us to adjust and adapt technological solutions in time to the local context, place, or territory where they're deployed, instead of having a binary approach where we either use them or not. A paradigm shift in how we measure the impact of AI systems is at the core of the IEEE 7010 recommended practice for assessing the impact of AI on human well-being. The metrics framework introduced in the standard is building based on a number of existing well-being measurement frameworks used in policy and sustainable development, including the Gross National Happiness Index in Bhutan. The work was also inspired by the idea that having metrics which encompass the so-called triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit, would be a more holistic and beneficial approach to measuring and validating the design and output of AI systems. There is often a confusion around the term well-being, and oftentimes people think of it in terms of happiness. However, within our work on 7010, we defined well-being as the continuous and sustainable physical, mental, social flourishing of individuals, communities, and populations, where their economic needs are cared for within a thriving ecological environment. So therefore, right from the start, human well-being is defined to include aspects of environmental well-being. This sunburst diagram you see here is a visualization of the metrics frameworks we created. It includes subjective and objective measures encompassing the domains of affect, community, culture, education, economy, environment, human settlements, health, government, psychological well-being, satisfaction with life, and work. In some more recent work, we propose that AI impact assessments could be implemented in practice through participatory, transparent engagement processes, which use a well-being indicator dashboard as a means of providing sufficient level of accountability and trust among AI system developers, policymakers, impacted communities, and other stakeholders. In another recent collaboration, we looked at the intersection of AI and community well-being and understanding and measuring the impact of AI on well-being, as well as how could we engage communities in the development and deployment of AI, specifically investigating how the use of AI in itself is a threat to community well-being, and what can communities do to mitigate, manage, or negate that threat. Disentangling the perceived challenges experienced by specific communities such as indigenous peoples and informal caregivers, we sought to examine the ways in which AI is being developed and used currently, and point to mechanism design and methodological insights that can bring about positive outcomes, contributing to community inclusion, equity, and data justice. So armed with these few examples of the use of AI impact assessments, we look again at the considerations and questions at the forefront of the environmental justice movement. As Langton Weiner points out in his seminal work, Do Artifacts Have Politics?, I think that it's critical to acknowledge the illusion of tech solutionism, and that, quote, what matters is not technology itself, but the social or economic system in which it is embedded, end of quote. This idea is at the core of a theory that Weiner developed called social determination of technology, which applies to its fullest extent in the use of AI for climate. So a few considerations include that oftentimes the premise of machine learning is to automate decision-making, and this often means that as a result, some of the human inputs will be disregarded or excluded from the decision-making process. Additionally, machine learning methods can come as a cheap solutions to problems that instead require a much deeper engagement. Environmental justice activists have referred to some uses of AI as helicopter science, which lacks understanding of the local context. Furthermore, most AI systems can be optimized for different purposes based on the business model which is being applied. And we need to acknowledge that the same system can be used for different ends, and we need to pause and ask, how could this technology be misused? And how are we going to provide transparency and accountability? So this brings me back to the approach I think could help us maximize the positive impact of the use of AI for climate, which is centered on the notion of developing new modes of engagement among interdisciplinary stakeholders and all aspects of the design, development, deployment, oversight, and ultimately the shutdown of an AI project. So this is what true responsibility looks like. I think that we need socio-technical safeguards which enable local and indigenous communities to veto the use of an AI system. This is something we also heard during our ethnographic work with the Partnership on AI nonprofit, where we investigated how organizational structure and culture hinders or enables the ethical use of AI. Responsibility relates to our ability to respond to the ways technical systems are transforming our livelihoods. Cyberfeminist Donna Haraway says, quote, responsibility is about both absence and presence, killing and nurturing, living and dying. and remembering who lives and who dies and how in the string figures of natural cultural history. End of quote. The technology is not neutral. We are inside of what we make, and it's inside of us. End of quote. The role of design for responsibility, I think, is to enable a system of mutual beneficial relationships through framing and understanding living systems interrelationships in a place-based and integrated way. By doing so, the potential for the use of AI for climate moves beyond sustaining the environment to one that can regenerate its health. With that, this is perhaps the most important slide that would be good if you are interested in this field and to take a screenshot and just kind of look up some of the resources later. And I'm super excited to be here and looking forward to questions. Please do not hesitate to ping me on email. Super looking forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bogdana.
Thank you, Bogdana. Now, please do not hesitate to put your questions. We have one question from Tatiana Bogdana, and it is how to recollect the data.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because as I had this slide with like cautionary tales of the use of machine learning in climate, right? That's part of the challenge that oftentimes it seems like there is a lot of data for the application of AI. But oftentimes people disregard like, okay, what is this data, right? Like, where does it come from? Who collected it? What might be potential biases that are in that data set, right? So I think that's actually like a very complex question of what data do we need? Where do we find it, right? Like who collected it, and really investigating the whole data curation process. And there are a number of scholars in the fairness, accountability, and transparency of AI community that have been very vocal about the importance of data curation and investigating like how is data collected and who collected it and what might be some biases in the data set that would ultimately leak into the building of any model, right, that uses the data. So one specific project to look up, it's called the Data Nutrition Label. And some collaborators at Harvard Law School also, they literally created a nutrition label for data sets that the idea is to help everybody who's going to use those data sets to have more visibility into those potential biases that might be in the data. So yeah, I hope that helps give some direction because it is a very challenging question.
Awesomeness. And you know, you were talking about like specific tools and specific biases that we need to consider during your presentation, as well during this answer to this question. And the next question is what are some of the best approaches in a responsible AI that you are currently seeing that are being put into action?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that question because it really goes into the heart of what I'm doing, which is around AI impact assessment. And the best approaches that I've seen that actually people are using are bringing in qualitative measurement frameworks and really the social sciences into the very technical AI evaluation and testing methodologies, right? And in that sense, kind of going beyond measuring simple accuracy metrics on a test set, but expanding that sort of toolbox in terms of how do we define like success for our model, right? So I see more and more such qualitative measurement frameworks. And I think that's really great. Like, and we really need more of that, sort of bridging the gap between quantitative and qualitative measurement frameworks. And qualitative frameworks is really where like more of the social sciences and people, I guess specifically in the context of AI and climate, really environmental scientists and policymakers, right, like other kinds of disciplines could tremendously contribute to how do we evaluate the success of our AI system.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for that question.
We have another question from Hemnalini, and it says, how do you recommend that researchers considering using AI start thinking on what questions to ask regarding the impact of the research?
I love that question as well. I think it's fascinating that some of the major conferences in the AI research community have been now including this sort of impact assessment as part of the paper peer review publication process. So asking really, as you're saying, researchers to actively think about this. I think that for me, the best resource has been building relationships and connections with people from other fields who could really challenge my way of thinking about an AI system. And in that sense, really trying to understand what is the model that I'm building and what is it really trying to do in the world by looking at it from the lens of other people. So in that sense, like building interdisciplinary relationships and understanding about what other people are concerned about, right, in terms of the specific model or application we're doing. And even more so with what I presented, right, we talk about community well-being, right? So directly talking to people who might be interested in using the model, right? And I think this is where we go very far away from research, right? And it's not in many times, like it's not part of like a researcher's agenda to connect with impacted communities, but just thinking about, right, like who else in the world, right, is could benefit, right, from this model, or could be impacted, right, because it could be both intended and unintended impacts. So yeah, building more relationships. But that's a great question. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Hem, for the question and you for the answer, Bogdana. The next question is again from Alexander. What is the best qualitative data framework that you have seen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of organizations that are doing AI impact assessment have been working on that. Actually, the government of Canada published, it's an open source qualitative framework that has been given as an example. And I think it's really great. It's very broad in that sense, and it's open source. Usually also, I think it actually depends on the application, right? And it's helpful when these kind of qualitative frameworks are related to like the specific area where the model is applied. Many times, for example, in financial services, where we see really an uptake of AI impact assessment, the kind of questions they ask will be different than the kind of questions in the environmental space, right? And many times this is driven from regulation and what are the regulators asking, right? Specifically in the financial services space. I think that in the environmental space, there could be different drivers, right, potentially, and in that sense, it needs to look differently. So yeah, I think it's an open area of research, and there's really no one single like solution to it. But this discussion is a great start, absolutely, and really love this question.
Okay, thank you, Alexander, for the question, and thanks, Bogdana. Do we have any more questions? Please do not hesitate to put them on the question and answer tool or on Facebook.
I have another question for you, Bogdana. You were talking about specifically the socio-ecological impact of AI, right? We're seeing how as well that that specific strain that the technology has on all of us. And we have seen it with the pandemic. We're seeing that towards the future. And I think that recognizing that as the community, right, that is around those systems we're creating those systems, we're part of those systems, it's important. But how do you think that we can make sure that more population understands the deep impacts of AI and how can they become more active in their role within the same development and use of the technology?
I think that's a great question, and it really goes at the heart of where I was going with this sort of collaboration and coalition building, right? And I think a lot of the work I've been very glad to be involved when it's also related to that, like how do we bring together interdisciplinary stakeholders so that we could create and facilitate collaboration, such that, as you say, it really needs to be industry together with impacted communities, together with academics, researchers, policymakers, civil society organizations. So in that sense, for me, I think it is really around like being able to facilitate cooperation and coordination. And some of the IEEE work we're doing, I think this is really the goal. And as a standards body, like this sort of third-party organizations could come in and be really a big proponent for ethical AI and like ethical use of AI, but I think oftentimes people are discouraged because seeing the gap between principles and practice, right, and seeing the challenges, which is why I think that it's important for just doing applied work in the field, right, both in industry or impacted communities, and really trying to translate the work in different languages in a way. But like becoming better at facilitating this interdisciplinary discussions and being able to move beyond the conversation itself, right, into doing something practically and small projects that really show the impact.
Yeah, I think that's such an important part, because most people think or see AI as such an unreachable thing, right? Like it's such a wide concept. But if we put it in little things and little steps within the cycle of life of AI, then it's not that complicated, really. Okay, Mariana, I think has another question for you from the Q&A.
Yes, it's also on the same line of this past question. There are two questions, and I will put them into one. From Jaime, he asks, in the information used to train the AI is open to review and the results also. And he asks too, how can a non-AI expert get involved? That is on the same line of the past answer.
I hope I would love to share these slides with you. And in the resources slide that I had, and I can pull it up on the screen again, because I think that one really like easy way to get involved is, just one second, maybe I can just share the screen again, is through here. So through participating in different communities. So I've been very grateful to be involved in all of these communities that I've listed here. And I mean, this is also to the extent that you, of course, like have time and resources to be involved. I mean, resources in terms of time, really, and like internet connection. But all of these communities are open to anyone on the internet. Like this is also like, how do we consider people off the internet, right? And this is really why I was talking during the talk about this notion of place-based technology, right? Or considering place and territory. And this could like sort of help us expand beyond like people on the internet, right? But all of these communities are a great way to get involved, kind of specifically what aspect you wish to get involved with, right? So, for example, the Environmental Data Justice Group is really one of the leading, for me, like organizations that is really doing a lot of work around environmental data justice. And I don't have it here, but I mentioned the Universal Declaration of Mother Earth community, and there's the IEEE working groups, and of course, I mean, we are right now connected in the AI for Climate community. So I think that you're already doing a really great job. But yeah, hopefully these are helpful, and I'll again like be happy to connect on email and connect one-on-one.
Thank you so much. I also think that yes, one of the main goals, and I think that all of us that are involved on AI for climate and to push forward the 2030 SDGs are more than happy to welcome more people into the community to create these kinds of projects and make sure that everybody sees that even though you're not a technical person or an expert on a topic, you can definitely contribute as well. There's another question. I think this is going to be the last one just for the sake of time. Which is from Roberto. He asks, which would be the best tools to work on the data mining and usage for a complete AI system?
Great question. Yes, so data mining and usage. So I think it sort of depends on what is the application, right? And what kind of data you're working with. Tools, and also what are you doing, like what is the purpose, right? So is it collecting the data, or is it pre-processing the data, right, and like doing some AI modeling with it, or some other, like looking for some kind of pattern in the data? There are a lot of like AI tools and libraries that one could use, but I guess my answer is that it sort of depends on the application. But what I was trying to highlight in the talk, right, is to think about these sort of hidden biases in the data and potentially investigate that, right? Because then anything that we do with the data in terms of machine learning modeling, those biases that might be present in the data set will impact and lead to such unintended consequences, right, or discrimination, really. And this could have, and like without investigating this, we don't know about it, right? So specifically for like this sort of analyzing bias in a data set, I would love to refer to you to one of these communities that I had in there called Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency of AI. And there are a number of tools in there around, well, it's framed as fairness metrics, but fairness and bias are ultimately like the two sides of the same coin, right? Because the way that fairness is defined oftentimes is through such sort of biases in the data. And that's one approach to it. And looking, okay, something else could be looking for proxies in the data set. So this is even sometimes, even if we're not using what's called protected classes, such as age, gender, race, ethnicity, in terms of like people data, right? This could be inferred by other variables in a data set, right? So there are these hidden interdependencies between different kinds of variables in a data set. And we need to use some statistical methods to be able to like figure that out, right? And because otherwise it could lead to other kinds of bias or discrimination, right, in the model outputs.
Awesome.
That was such a complete answer.
Yeah.
I feel like I learned so much more from you.
Okay. Well, I think that the time is over, but thank you so much, Bogdana, for sharing with us all your knowledge and to have this talk on this important topic. And thanks for the audience, for everyone watching. We hope that you can join us on the next few days that we will continue having this Lightning Talk series until August 5 at 5 p.m. Central Time. So we hope to see you here again. And have a nice day, everyone. Thank you, Bogdana.
Thank you.
Bogdana. See you, everyone, tomorrow, 5 p.m.
Yeah, thank you so much.